we always heard that the Taliban were narco terrorists was the term that I think was
Hmm.
invented in the early 2000s to describe this. And anytime we heard about the drug production that was going on in Afghanistan, which was very much soft pedaled and very much not in the news, but to the extent it was, we always heard that the Taliban were responsible. Now, in looking into this, I found that there's no evidence to support it at all. And I don't claim that my research skills are exhaustive, but if there's anyone out there who can find a case of a named Taliban individual who was seized or apprehended or convicted, or it was otherwise shown for a fact that they were producing or trafficking drugs, please get in touch because I wasn't able to find a single case of that. Um, and you don't have to take my word for it because in 2018, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, they put out a report, a retrospective on narcotics in Afghanistan. And this is a U.S. government publication. So, they kind of couch it in delicate terms, but it's very clear from reading that report that their conclusion that they came to was that there was never any evidence at all to back up the idea that the Taliban were either profiting from the direct participation in drug production or were even taxing it, as we sometimes heard. The best I think you could say is that at times some groups that were called Taliban, which is actually a more diverse coalition than we realize, some of those groups at times in certain places may have levied attacks on other drug traffickers. But that's beyond that. There's no reason to think that the Taliban participated in the drug trade. It also goes against, their, as I mentioned before, their original ideological identity of being a force that was against narcotics. The Taliban would occasionally put out edicts that banned their own fighters from using drugs or participating at all in the drug trade. We never gave them any credit for that, but in fact, it seems to be pretty consistent on their part. Now,
and
who
Seth,
was responsible?
Seth, to the economic point, Afghanistan, obviously a poor country under sanctions by the U.S. We also withheld a significant chunk of their central bank reserves. After we left, there was a sort of economic free fall, at least for a certain period of time. So what has been the economic impact of the total eradication of poppy production when it was so central to the agricultural economy?
Well, it's hard to say. Probably not good for the farmers that have immediately lost out on their poppy revenue that they were making. But Afghanistan has really serious economic problems as a result of the crushing international sanctions that are on them and the fact that the U.S. basically just stole all the money that was in their bank by freezing it. So Afghanistan is in a terrible economic situation right now, which makes it all the more remarkable that the Taliban was willing to eliminate what had been the majority, of their GDP. It really shows that they were determined to eliminate this trade from Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's shocking about this is that it turns a lot of stuff on its head. Like you said, Seth, I worked in that space for a long time. I covered the Pentagon during the Afghan war. We heard constantly narco-terrorists, that these people were involved in drug production, that they were much more drug lords than they were this. But then it's a little bit counter. If all of that gets shut down the moment that they actually take over the country, you would presume that the inverse would happen, that when you have total control over state resources, you would ramp opium production up. So then if they weren't producing the opium, somebody was, and somebody was profiting. I'm sure you don't want to give away too much, but to what role can you speak about from your own book to the deep involvement of the U.S. military forces in perhaps not only officially sanctioning this, but getting involved in the actual moving and selling of drugs?
Well, that same SIGAR report that I mentioned a moment ago is unequivocal about this.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S.-backed Afghan government at every level and at every geographic region of Afghanistan was either directly involved in producing drugs or was profiting from it in the form of bribes or taxation. All of the major warlords who comprised the U.S. client state, under Hamid Karzai originally and under Ashraf Ghani later, were known narcotics traffickers. Fahim Khan was Hamid Karzai's defense minister. He was a big-time drug trafficker. Hamid Karzai's half brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai,
Mm-hmm.
was the kingpin of Kandahar, who had the,
Yes.
as they would say in Mexico, the derecho de piso over the entire Helmand, the ability to charge drug traffickers, a commission to move drugs through Kandahar. I mentioned Rashid Dostum a moment ago, up on the border of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. He was a major drug lord. The CIA worked closely with him. Hazarat Ali in Jalalabad, another big time drug trafficker controlling the drug trade from Afghanistan to India, which absorbed a lot of the heroin during this time. And these are all people who have names, whose role is known. And the way that it was done out in the open is really kind of jaw dropping. And it's not just the people at the top. It's, as the Saigar report said, people at every single level and every department of the Afghan government were directly involved in the drug trade. And if you ask any grunt who served in Afghanistan, a Marine, whatever, they'll tell you that the security forces of these people under these warlords, they used drugs constantly and were often too stoned on hashish or opium to even go out and patrol. So the Afghan client state was the world's biggest drug cartel, and it was directly backed at all times by JSOC, the CIA, and the whole of the U.S. government. And past instances of like CIA complicity in the drug trade that we're familiar with pale in comparison. You know, there's the whole Dark Alliance thing that reporter Gary Webb revealed in the 90s that the CIA knew that the Nicaraguan Contras were trafficking cocaine from Colombia through Mexico into the United States at the time of the crack boom. I mean, that was significant, but there's just no comparing the scale of this. As I mentioned before, for 20 years, Afghanistan inundated the entire world with extremely cheap, extremely potent, and extremely high quality heroin. It was available everywhere, and that changed. That had a huge impact on history, an extremely deleterious effect on the social fabric of many countries that directly surround Afghanistan, including Iran had a terrible heroin crisis during this time. China as well had to really crack down on heroin trafficking through Xinjiang, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the Uyghur occupied part of China. Russia suffered a terrible heroin crisis during this time, all of Europe and of course America. And it was all the result of having a huge glut of very high quality and very cheap product that was available.
Seth, my last question for you is an intentionally naive one. How does this square with the U.S.'s relatively draconian anti-drug policies?
Well, when you say relatively draconian anti-drug policies, I guess you're referring to the criminal penalties that are available to punish traffickers that are caught here in the U.S. Well, it just goes to show that, you know, the government really kind of, instead of fighting a drug war, it's more that they pick winners and losers in the game and say who is allowed to traffic drugs internationally. Because if the DEA at any point had wanted to look at Afghanistan and say, you know, sometimes when they say describe a drug trafficking organization in Mexico, let's say, and create like an organization chart and put this guy at the top and say these guys are his lieutenants, a lot of that there's some artistic license that goes into that. These groups are not as coherent as you might think. My point is that if at any point they had wanted to look at Afghanistan and describe what was going on there as a cartel and create like an organization chart, it easily could have been portrayed as, you know, this is the most profitable, productive, and dangerous drug trafficking organization in the entire world. And it's inundating the United States with heroin because the heroin crisis in the United States perfectly coincided with this time period. And there's endless reports from the early 2000s from medical professionals and others, especially county sheriffs, talking about how they were seeing a much increased supply of heroin in the most remote rural counties in the United States, not just the cities. The whole country was saturated by heroin that was white in color, high quality, high potency. Now, as a caveat, the DEA says that none of this came from Afghanistan. They say that the United States alone in the world is the only country untouched by Afghan heroin. And that's a claim that you see sometimes repeated in mainstream media accounts during this time. And in my book, I'm going to go into all the reasons why I don't think that's true at all. I think that that all of that supply, or the great majority of that supply that directly caused the heroin crisis in America, was a consequence of the war in Afghanistan.
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, well, Seth, we're going to let you now get back to writing that book because we're now all dying to read it and see what else you have to say. And I hope you'll come back on when the book is published, if not before, and explain in detail your additional findings.